Salute omnes, and welcome back. In this video, we will be going through Caesar Book 5, chapters 24 and 25, following the AP Latin syllabus. Again, before we get started, just a quick reminder of our coding for Caesar. We have red, as always, indicating our subjects, green will indicate our verbs, and blue will indicate our direct objects. Also, a reminder that bold-faced print indicates the main clause of each sentence, and if it's not in bold, then it's subordinate in some way. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get started. And we start off in chapter 24 with two ablative absolutes, subductis navibus concilioque gallorum samarobrivae peracto. So the campaigning season has ended, right? If we're aware of our context, the campaigning season has ended. Caesar has just invaded Britain again and come back, and so the subductis navibus, the ships have been drawn up, okay, onto the beach or whatever, and there was a concilio gallorum, so there was a meeting of the Gauls at Samarobriva. So this is Samarobriva is a locative because Samarobriva is a city. And peracto, the concilio has been concluded. All right, it has been finished. So these two things have just occurred and are the background scene setting for what is coming next. Quod. Now this quod is not relative. It has nothing to do with the concilio. It is in fact causal. Because eo anno, that year, frumentum, the grain, or in this case particularly the crop, the harvest, in Gallia, simple ablative, place where, propter siccitates, on account of, siccitates is accusative because of the preposition, on account of dryness, or more broadly, on account of a drought. Angustius provenerat. So the grain more narrowly, angustius is a comparative adverb, more narrowly had come in, or just less, right? So this year, on account of a drought in Gaul, the grain, or the harvest, had come in less. So all of this has been subordinate with ablative absolutes in this factual clause, setting up what Caesar was compelled to do. Coactus est. Caesar was compelled. Caesar is the understood subject of coactus est, passive form of cogo. He was forced aliter ac superioribus annis. So aliter ac is a comparative type expression. It's not actually a comparative adjective or adverb itself. It's just an expression that implies a comparison. Differently than. Okay, differently than. And then superioribus annis is an ablative of time when. In previous years. So differently than in previous years, Caesar was compelled to do what? His army in winter camps to place, and his legions among various tribes to distribute. So Caesar was forced to place his army and distribute his legions differently than usual. Typically, what would Caesar do? He would build one large, centrally located winter camp, well fortified, and keep everybody there. But this year, because of the grain situation, he has to distribute his legions so as not to overwhelm any one area or any one tribe with the need to provide grain for the Romans. Okay, so now we're going to get a quick accounting of how Caesar distributed his legions, and you can see that this is just very straightforward. It's just boom, boom, boom. Caesar's just making a list. He starts off ex quibus. This is referring, of course, to legionibus, and the quibus here is really his, right? Ex his legionibus. Again, we've seen many times that when Caesar starts a sentence referring to something from the previous sentence, instead of using the demonstrative pronoun hic haec hoc, Caesar prefers to use the relative pronoun qui quae quod. It's not actually starting any kind of relative clause, it's simply referring back to the thing that Caesar was just talking about. So, ex quibus legionibus, out of these legions, and then we're going to get the accounting. Unam, one legion. Ducendam is what we understand it with. That's a gerundive. Something like to be led. All right, one legion was to be led into the territory of the Morini. Okay, ducendam is why in is with the accusative here, not the ablative. They're being brought to this territory. To Gaius Fabius a legatus he gave. All right, so Gaio Fabio legato is just dative indirect object because of dodare, nothing special. And it's worth mentioning that we see this word legatus. We're going to see this a lot in chapter 5, book 5, I should say. We've seen it before in books 1 and 4. When we've seen this word legatus before, it has typically meant something like delegate or ambassador, someone who's sent with a message to someone. Okay, the Britanni legatus ad Caesarem de pace, right? They sent delegates to Caesar about peace. Here in Book 5, because we're talking about legions, the legatus is technically the commander of a legion. All right, Caesar himself is the dux, the general of the army, but each individual legion has a legatus, or someone who is placed in that position. So commander. So same word, but different meaning here. So Caesar gave one legion to be brought into the territory of the Morini to Gaius Fabius as a commander. All right, and that is the model for the next two. Another legion, still ducendam, to be brought into the territory of the Nervii, he assigned to Quintus Cicero as the commander, brother of the famous orator Marcus. A third legion to be brought into the territory of the Esubii, he gave to Lucius Roscius as the commander. And then for the rest of it, after the semicolon, he structures it slightly differently. Let's have a look. A fourth legion in the territory of the Remi, with Titus Labienus as the commander, on the borders of the Treveri, another tribe, to winter there he commanded. So slightly different. He orders this fourth legion to spend the winter. That's why in with the ablative here, not accusative, because ducendam is not governing our thoughts anymore, right, with quartam. So he ordered a fourth legion to winter in the territory of the Remi with Labienus as their commander. No datives anymore because he's not assigning, he's simply ordering. And then this is a useful thing to remember that Caesar mentions it, in confinio Treverorum, on the borders of the Treveri, right, a different tribe. That's going to be important later, so file that away. Okay, continuing on. 3 other legions. So for those keeping count, we're up to 7. 3 other legions among the Belgae he placed. All right, Kolokawit. Caesar has been the subject of everything. Eis, this is a dative, we'll come back to it in 1 second, to these troops, Marcus Crassus as a quaestor, and Lucius Munatius Plancus and Gaius Trebonius as commanders, praefecit. He assigned, or he placed in charge. All right, so he is placing in charge, Caesar, is placing in charge these 3 men for these troops. All right, a dative of reference there, not an indirect object because we're not giving or showing or telling, we are assigning, all right, or placing in command. We see that Plancus and Trebonius are legati, so they are commanders. Crassus is a quaestorem. All right, technically a quaestor is something like a quartermaster. All right, it's a slightly lower rank, but he's still in charge. Handles things like food supply, soldier pay, etc., etc., etc. All right, so not worth too much mention, but there it is. 3 legions among the Belgae. Okay, and then we come to this part, the last legion, unam legionem, quam proxime transpadunt conscripserat. So we get a description of this legion, which recently, across the Po, so on the other side of the Po, so therefore in Italy, he had conscripted, or he had raised, right? He had gathered. That's Caesar. So we learned something about this legion that we don't learn about the other legions, specifically that this is a new legion. Et cohortes quinque, and 5 cohorts. And if we remember our legion structure, a legion has 10 cohorts. So this is basically 1.5 legions into the territory of the Eburones. And then we learn a little bit about the Eburones, whose territory, pars meaning like land, maxima est, mostly is between these 2 rivers, the Mosa and the Rhenum. So we know that we're near the Germans, okay, because we're near the Rhine. And then also about the Eburones, qui is also taking Eburones as its antecedent, just like quorum was. Sub imperio Ambiorigis et Catuvolci, under the command or rule of Ambiorix and Catavulcus, they were. All right, he sent. So he sent 1 legion and 5 cohorts. A newly raised legion, into the territory of the Eburones, who live in this particular region of Gaul and who are ruled by these two guys, Ambiorix and Catuvolcus. Why did we not get any of this useful information about the other tribes and the other legions? Because Caesar is setting up the players in the story that he is about to tell. Ambiorix and Catuvolcus, Ambiorix in particular, will be very important moving forward, so remember this name. All right, continuing on, talking still about these 1.5 legions, to these soldiers, Quintus Titurius Sabinus and Lucius Aurunculeius Cotta as commanders, to be in charge, he commanded. All right, Caesar usit. So Caesar ordered these two guys, Sabinus and Cotta, to be in charge for these troops. All right, again, Caesar takes the time to highlight that these two guys are in charge, Sabinus and Cotta, because these characters are going to be important. So remember these names. All right, the legions are now fully distributed. We see that because of the ablative absolute, telling us that everything's done. The legionibus have been distributis. The legions have been distributed ad hunc modum. Literally to this effect, but in English we might say in this way. Facilime inopiae frumentarii sese mederi posse existimavit. Still Caesar. Caesar felt, or estimated, thought, that, so we're going into indirect statement, that explains why sese, the accusative, is marked as the subject, that he himself could, or just he, Caesar felt that he could facilime mederi, right? The superlative adverb goes with mederi, the infinitive, deponent, most easily mediate or mitigate the inopiae frumentarii. Now we notice that inopiae frumentarii is marked as the object. It is the object of mederi, and it is dative because mederi, the verb medeor, wants a dative. So instead of an accusative, we get a dative object. Caesar felt that this way he could most easily mitigate the lack of grain because he's not putting inordinate pressure on just one tribe. All right, continuing on, talking about how these legions have been distributed. The winter camps, hiberna, this is going to be an extremely important word in Book 5 of Caesar because we are talking about Roman troops in winter camps, not in their daily camps, their castra. Of all of these legions, the winter camps, we see this big genitive here, harum omnium legionem, the winter camps of all of these legions except praeteream, we get a little preposition here, except for the one, and then we get this relative clause talking about which legion in particular, the one which to Lucius Roscius, to be led, ducendam with quam, remember the structure from before, a couple sentences back, was led into the most peaceful and quietest territory. Again, using the word pars for terra or something like that, regio, right, region, he had given. So except for the legion which Caesar had given to Lucius Roscius to be led into the calmest part of Gaul, apart from that legion, all the winter camps, or the winter camps of all the rest of the legions, were contained, continebantur takes hiberna as its subject, were contained within, we see millibus as ablative, so we know that it's a place where, or more specifically, place within which, within 100 miles. So all of these winter camps that Caesar has distributed, apart from one, are within 100 miles of each other. Also, an interesting point. All right, and then we're coming to the end of the first chapter. Ipse interea. So ipse tells us we're back to Caesar as the subject. We had hiberna as the subject in the last sentence. In the meanwhile, he himself, until quoad. This conjunction is actually made up of two words. You can see quo and ad. Quo means to where, and ad means to, obviously. So when you put those together in Latin, you get a word that means something like up to the point that, or until. Until, and then we see here, we see lots of accusative-looking things marked as subjects, and we see these participle-looking things marked as verbs. Tells us we're in indirect speech, being governed by cognovicet. Until Caesar knew that, right, and there's an esse missing here for both collectas and munita, obviously. Until Caesar knew that his legions were placed, right, and his winter camps were fortified, Until he knew that, he himself decided to delay, to stay a while in Gallia, in Gaul. All right. Why does Caesar mention this? Because his typical practice would be to set up his winter camp, typically in just one area with all the soldiers there, and then Caesar would depart to northern Italy, not in Italia proper, still in his proconsular territory, because he's not allowed to cross into Italia while he has proconsular power. He would travel to that area near Italy so that he could more easily do business with Rome. He wouldn't have to wait weeks and weeks for messages to arrive. This year, though, Caesar changes his pattern and stays a while in Gaul. This will also become important. All right, let's move on to chapter 25 now, where we take what seems like a little bit of a digression into local politics. Erat, there was. Remember that when est is the first word of a sentence, we tend to say there is or there was, as opposed to he is or he was. There was among the Carnutes, right, in Carnutibus, among this tribe, sumo loco natus, right? So we have someone, we don't know who yet, who was born in the highest rank or class. All right, locus here doesn't mean place as much as it means station in society. Tasgetius. Okay, who is this guy? Well, we're going to find out. Whose ancestors, Cuius is taking Tasgetius as its antecedent, whose ancestors in their tribe, or in Tasgetius' tribe, technically as a reflexive, sua should refer to Tasgetius. In context, it makes sense to refer to Maiores. It's all the same family, so it's not really a huge deal. In their tribe, they had obtained rulership, lordship. Notice this is in the past. So Tasgetius is from a family that used to rule the Carnutes. All right. Huic, still Tasgetius, referring to Tasgetius here. To him, or for him, as we'll see. Caesar, all right, right there, Caesar. Pro eius virtute atque in se benevolentia. So we have a prepositional phrase here with two appletives, virtute and benevolentia, going with pro. And in exchange for is typically what pro means. In exchange for his courage and his benevolentia. So this is something like kindness, or literally good wishing, right? Good wishes, good attitude. We'll say kindness. In exchange for Tasgetius's virtute, because eius is referring to Tasgetius, because Caesar's our subject now. In exchange for his courage and his kindness to him, this reflexive is referring to Caesar, his kindness to Caesar, because it's not a relative, it's a causal, because in every fight, or in all the wars, whatever, with his, so this is an ablative here, singulari opera. Those two words go together. They're both ablatives. Singulari is from the third declension, which is why it has an I in the ablative case instead of an E, right? It's an I stem. And in this case, singularis means singular, but not in the sense of just one. It means singular in the sense of rarest or most unique or most special, all right? So in all of the wars, with his particular or with his special aid, eius is still referring to Tasgetius, fuerat usus, he had been of use. We've seen this expression usus est before. We saw it in book 4. It typically means to be of use. So Tasgetius was of use to Caesar in his wars by means of, right, this ablative of means, by means of his particular aid. What was that aid? We don't know, right? But it has to do apparently with virtus, with courage, and also with benevolentia, so good attitude, right? Or well-wishing, something like that. So Tasgetius was allied to Caesar and had assisted him. And because of that, Caesar had restored him, had restored the position of his ancestors to him. All right, so Caesar had placed Tasgetius in charge of the Carnutes. Pretty standard politicking and alliance making so far. What is so special then? Well, here we go, we find out. Tertium iam hunc annum. This is an accusative of time, all right? In English, we might find it easier to say in the third year he was ruling, regnantem. We see the participle down there. Goes with eum. We'll get there in a second. You might also, since it is an accusative duration of time, we might say for the third year now that he was ruling, okay? Inimici, enemies. And then we get this ablative absolute that gives us more information about the Inimici, with many of them openly from his tribe as authors. Now, what do we mean authors? Probably leaders or leaders of the conspiracy. All right, so many people from the Carnutes themselves rose up against Tasgetius and killed him. Eum interfecerunt. They killed him. Okay, so perhaps Tasgetius was not as popular as Caesar thought. The follow-up sentence is dead simple. This matter was brought to Caesar, right? Brought to his attention. And then we get the more convoluted sentence. Ille, Caesar. He, fearing veritus, all right? This is being afraid. This is a deponent verb, vereor, which is why this participle looks passive, but we understand it as active. He was afraid. It's just a participle. It's not a verb. There's no est missing. That's why it's marked as part of the subject. Because, now we have two clauses that follow. The first one is a causal clause, quod. The second one is the fearing clause, nay, what Caesar is afraid of. So we'll do the causal clause first. Because ad plures, to many people, pertinebat, this matter pertained. All right. This is referring to the fact that many people were involved in the conspiracy and murder of Tasgetius. So this wasn't a small group of people working. This was a large group of people. Caesar was afraid because this matter pertained to many people among the Carnutes and possibly among other tribes. He was afraid that, we remember that with fearing clauses, ne is positive, ut is negative. So this is what he was afraid of. The tribe, by their, or on account of their attack, Aorum is referring to the conspirators, on account of their attack, the tribe would fail. And what do we mean by fail here? Deficeret. We mean collapse. All right. So Caesar is afraid that a rebellion might spring up among the Carnutes, especially because so many people were apparently involved in the murder of Tasgetius. He is afraid of this. So he commands, Eubet is down there, right? We see Eubet down here. He commands Lucius Plancus with his legion from the territory of the Belgae quickly into the territory of the Carnutes to go, to set out. All right? So he reacts, he sends an entire legion into the land of the Carnutes to, presumably deal with this. And sure enough, that's what we see. So this is the other two things that Caesar commands of this legion. Ibique hiamare, to winter there. All right? So now this legion will not be wintering among the Belgae anymore. They will be spending the winter among the Carnutes. And now, this quorum, this relative clause here that starts with quorum has hosts as its antecedent. This is an example of prolepsis, right? The stylistic device sliding in front. The relative clause has slid in front of its antecedent. So as we read it, we need to understand that the people we're talking about are the men or the people who are going to be comprehensos, who are going to be arrested. All right? So let's hold off on this relative clause for half a second. Let's go deal with that main thought down at the bottom. The third thing that Caesar commanded was that Plancus send to him, we're reading backwards now, mittere ad se, send to Caesar the men after they are arrested. Now we can go to quorum. By whose aid, right? Because opera means the same thing we saw above. It means aid. It's not opus operis. It's opera, operae. So this is ablative, opera. By means of whose support he had learned Tasgetius had been killed. Okay, so the idea here is that Plancus has been tasked with arresting people who are useful. That's the idea of opera, by whose help, right? Don't just go to the Carnutes and arrest anybody. Find the people who knew what was going on. Find the conspirators. Find the leaders of the conspiracy. Arrest them and send them to Caesar, all right? So that with their help, he can figure out what went on with Tasgetius' murder. Okay, it's not the most obvious thing when you first read it, but that's what Caesar wants. All right, so Plancus is to go to the land of the Carnutes with his legion, spend the winter there, and send to Caesar people who will be useful to him in learning what was going on with Tasgetius. In the meanwhile, from all of his commanders, remember legatis doesn't mean delegates, it means commanders, from all of his commanders and quaestore, right, that little reference to Crassus, who's not a legatus, he's a quaestor, to whom, quibus here is dative, indirect object because of tradiderat, just dodare again, to whom he had given legions, he became, literally, he became more certain, right? Certior factus est, or certior fit, right? Because the passive of facio is fio, fieri. This is an expression, it's just an idiom that means to learn or to be informed. Literally, though, it means more certain he became. So Caesar learned. You can just read that, right? Meanwhile, he ascertained or learned from, that's ob, right? All of the commanders and his quaestor to whom he had given legions. That, we go into indirect speech here, this perventum esse, it doesn't have a subject because it's an impersonal construction. Ventum est literally is just there was a coming. So what's missing? We're missing a dative of agents, right? Illis, there was a coming by them, right? So we have to understand that. It's referring also to the legions as well, so we might say they, okay? Caesar learned that they had come to winter camps. Literally, there was a coming by them into winter camps. And locum, that the place, munitum esse, had been fortified, hibernis, for the winter camps. So hibernis is dative. It's technically a dative of purpose. All right. So because a winter camp is not the same thing as the daily castra that the legion would construct on the march. This is a longer term, better constructed, better fortified winter camp. So it's this continual reference that Caesar's been making to munitum, right? Are the winter camps fortified? Meaning, have they been properly constructed and established for long-term inhabitants by the troops, but also long-term security, even if it is just for 3 or 4 months, security against any attack, right? We've seen this reference now. Caesar's mentioned this multiple times in the last couple chapters, that he wants to make sure that hiberna are munita. Okay, so in the meanwhile, Caesar is spending his time making sure that everyone is getting into their winter camps and that the locations are being properly fortified for wintering, for winter quarters or something like that, for wintering. Okay, why is Caesar spending all of this time doing this? Well, because of what's about to happen. And that's why in this chapter, chapter 25, we take this little seeming digression off to talk about this guy Tasgetius and the Carnutes, because this is a little taste of what is coming. There is rebellion in the air. And so as we continue on, we're going to see what comes of that. All right, and that brings us to the end of these 2 chapters. Caesar has set the stage, basically, for the drama that is about to unfold. And in the next 2 chapters, things are going to get very interesting very quickly. So we will see you then. Maximus gratias et valete.